even care. This planet's empty, I see no signs of life. Please don't tell me that the human race did not survive. There are no people in the future. There are no people. There are no people in the future. No people at all. There are no people in the future. Where did all my people go? There are no people in the future. Let me try my people call. Where are all my people? Where are all my people? I guess I'll fly away.
Hey, everybody, welcome. Yes, it is a Monday, June 12th, 2023. Sorry, check us out. Welcome to Raging Chicken's Out to Coop Live. This is Kevin Mahoney, creator and founder of Raging Chicken. On Out to Coop Live, we talk to progressives, activists, and troublemakers of all sorts, right from our own backyards and across the country. You can also join us live at the end of the week for our Friday Politics Roundup, where we break down the good, the bad, and the ugly in state and national politics. You can get all our shows by subscribing to our podcast on Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. And you can support this show by becoming a patron for as little as $5 a month. Head on over to patreon.com/rcpress today. You can help out the show right now by heading over to our YouTube channel if you're not there already. Smash that subscribe button, like the stream for this show, and hit that notification bell so you know every time that we go live. And if you're one of our awesome podcast listeners, make sure you leave us a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen on. And leave a comment to let other folks know why you like the show. Little things like this help other people find the show. And for more PA Progressive Talk, tune into the Rick Smith Show's live stream at 9 p.m. Eastern on his YouTube channel, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you get some streams. Make sure you subscribe to podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. Check out thericksmithshow.com for the latest across all his platforms. And check out the Sisters of the Night Caucus podcast. The amazing PA women stirring the political cauldron behind this podcast rock the house. And they know where the bodies are buried. Make sure to follow them on Twitter at The Night Caucus. That's at The Night Caucus on Twitter. And subscribe to their podcast at Anchor, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't heard, The Signal is a new podcast from the Bucks County Beacon. The Signal is hosted by the Beacon's editor-in-chief, Cyril Michaleko, and produced by yours truly. Twice a month, The Signal will shine a light on the right-wing extremist currents streaming through Bucks County and beyond. Cyril invites guests who can provide insight, analysis, and organizing solutions so that we can steer the community toward calmer, saner, progressive roots. Check them out on the buckscountybeacon.podbean.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And for all you gamers out there, The Game In is a Quakertown-based black family-owned gaming store. They're friends of the show, and they've got everything for retro N64s, latest consoles, video games for all platforms, collectibles, action figures, Funko Pops, walls of Funko Pops. And kids get discounts when they get A's in their report card, and it's the end of the school year, so get it while it's hot. What can I say? A little graduation gift? I don't know. Check them out on their Facebook page and follow them on Twitter at The Game In, again with 2 N's. Got a question about a game, look for something hard to get, shoot them a message or drop them an email at thegameinpa@gmail.com. And a shout out goes to Jonathan Mann, who wrote our intro song, There Are No People in the Future. Check out all his great stuff on his YouTube page and follow him on Twitter at SongAdayman, again 2 N's, at SongAdayman on Twitter. And we can't let Paul Martino, Moms for Liberty, and the oligarch friends buy our schools and push extremist politics in our community. Raging Chicken has teamed up with Levelfield to launch a truly community-rooted pact to invest in organizing, supporting local and statewide progressive candidates, and unmasking the toxic organizations injecting our communities with right-wing extremism. We're putting small dollar donations to work to beat back the power of big money. You get more information and drop your donation at ragingchicken.levelfield.net. We got some great stuff coming up on Out to Coop Live. Next Monday, June 19th, we got Mark Engler on the show. Mark is a Philly-based writer, author, and author of This Is an Uprising, How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century, and a member of the editorial board of Dissent. We'll be talking about his kind of relatively new article. We were supposed to have him on a couple weeks back, but can movements keep politicians from inevitably selling out? That appeared in Dissent, The Forge, and in Waging Nonviolence. Yeah, if you remember, we were supposed to have Mark on the show back in May, but I had to cancel the last minute. It had some family stuff that kind of got complicated very quickly. But luckily, Mark's awesome and willing to reschedule. So next Monday's show will be a pre-recorded show, just so you know. It will still premiere at 9 p.m. on our YouTube channel and all our podcast platforms. But the reason why you're here tonight, yes, indeed, is to welcome Aly Shaw to the show. On this episode of Out to Coop Live, we've got Aly Shaw, Pittsburgh-based research analyst working for the State Power Mapping Program at the grassroots watchdog group LittleSis, that opposite of Big Brother. And we'll be talking about her new report, The American Petroleum Institute Loves Pennsylvania, as its lobbying shows. In 2022, the API spent at least $1.8 million on lobbying in Pennsylvania politicians, and that's more than any other state. Why is Big Oil going all in on PA? Well, we'll get into the details. Aly previously spent 8 years as an environmental justice organizer at Pittsburgh UNITED and labor organizer at UFCW Local 1776. Hi, John. Over the years, she led campaigns to prevent the privatization of Pittsburgh water system, to make drinking water safer and more affordable, and organized grocery store workers to win higher wages and safer working conditions during the COVID-19 pandemic. She received her BA in political science from the University of Pittsburgh and her master's in public administration from Carnegie Mellon University. Welcome to the show, Aly.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I am thrilled that you could come on and that we could talk about this. Once again, we had you on the show last time to dig into Jeffrey Yass, and now here we are digging into Big Oil. I have to say, I had not. Again, this is one of these things that's like in the back of my brain sometimes, but realizing how much energy has defined the history and the kind of politics of Pennsylvania. As you mentioned in this piece, Pennsylvania is the second largest petroleum producer or natural gas or petroleum product producer, like a fossil fuel producer in the country, which is remarkable. And I'm glad to be talking to you today. If you think about, I was, getting ready for the show today. I'm like, well, just this week, we've come out a week of being blanketed in smoke from wildfires in Canada, right? Yesterday, a petroleum tanker kind of basically blew up, caught fire under a bridge at I-95 in Philadelphia, causing the whole bridge to collapse, right? And then as of today, this new court case, kind of unprecedented court case, kind of by a youth-led climate lawsuit in Montana started, which is basically challenging the state of Montana, basically saying they violated their own constitution, which guarantees the citizens of the state access to a clean environment. And this is going to be a historic case that's going to have implications kind of across the board for, I think, for the future of our politics. So, it seems to make sense that, okay, let's talk about some of the, the bad actors that are behind the scenes that have been fueling the fossil fuel economy and trying to, divert us from that climate change. So I'm so glad to have you on the show tonight.
Yeah, I know. I'm happy to be here and talk about these important issues, although it's always a little disheartening to talk about all of the bad actors in Pennsylvania. There are so many people organizing, doing good work, and the reason why Pennsylvania is not as bad as other fossil fuel producing states like Texas or West Virginia, but I think Pennsylvania is a key state because we have so many people organizing against the fossil fuel industry here. It is becoming more of a blue state. You have people organizing in Pittsburgh and Central PA and Philadelphia. I did some research behind the American Petroleum Institute and all the big money they're spending to drown out those voices for environmental justice.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you frame it in that way because it makes sense. This is one of the things I definitely wanted to talk about tonight because it seems like there's a lot of folks that are organizing and it makes sense while they're putting so much money in Pennsylvania. It's not because they're just going to hey, this is our favorite place. No, but they recognize what's at stake and they can feel the power not kind of moving in their direction, it would seem. But before we get into all the specifics of your piece, let's just kind of back up a little bit and talk about API, the American Petroleum Institute, a little bit of who these folks are and why they're so important to be focusing on at this moment.
Yeah. So I'll do a little bit of background behind why I even found them in the first place. I don't think a lot of Pennsylvanians think about the American Petroleum Institute as a group that's influencing the state because it's a federal group run by these international companies. So what are they doing in Pennsylvania? So I was doing some research for a statewide coalition that's taking on Jeffrey Yass, the richest man in the state, pouring millions of dollars into right-wing politics here, and taking on powerful corporations in the state that are influencing our politicians for their own pro-corporate, anti-worker, anti-environment agenda. And lobbying is not like campaign donations. It's not as easy to research, especially in Pennsylvania. You can't just, go on a website and, say who spends the most on in this industry, or who, spends the most time with these politicians lobbying them. It's much less transparent. So it wasn't that easy for me to find. So what I had to do was download all lobbying records from the past year into a giant Excel spreadsheet and try and sort it out. It was a complete mess. The Pennsylvania database is a really huge mess to try to grapple with. But what I ended up finding was that the American Petroleum Institute was the third biggest spender on lobbying in the state in 2022, which is pretty consistent with where they were in the past 5 or so years. You wouldn't probably be surprised that healthcare is the number one industry, and electric utilities are about number 2, and API is up there with the electric utilities. So I did some more digging into the American Petroleum Institute, who's behind them, and what they're actually doing with that money in Pennsylvania. And can you still hear me?
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay,
so I learned that the American Petroleum Institute has been around for decades. It is the trade association of all of the largest oil companies in the world. Companies like Exxon Mobil, British Petroleum, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, Shell, Phillips 66. Currently, it's being led by board chair Mike Wirth, who's the CEO of Chevron. All these companies kind of rotate leading the group. Even though it's run by these massive oil companies because they give the most money and sit on the board, it represents over 600 oil companies, refineries, plastic manufacturers, lots of companies in the oil business. It's been referred to as the whipping boy of big oil by some executives at Exxon Mobil, who were caught on tape saying that they use these trade institutions or trade associations to basically do their dirty work that these oil companies don't want to do. Exxon and Shell want to paint themselves as actually pro environmental justice. You see all these ads with BP and Exxon saying we're actually solving climate change. And they get to greenwash themselves and paint that picture of themselves while also donating millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars to this group, the American Petroleum Institute, and send that group out to lobby on their behalf in terms of not taxing oil companies, removing any regulation that might be imposed on oil companies, allowing them to build more infrastructure in the United States and abroad. So this is stuff that these companies don't really want on their hands, so they get to pass it off to this group that no one really knows about. And they don't only lobby in the federal government, and they spend millions of dollars every year, $4.4 million last year, lobbying the federal government. They also have become more active in state governments because they, I think, have rightly learned that is where a lot of the policies that are impacting them happen. Approval of projects, local regulations. So in Pennsylvania, they spent about $1.8 million last year. For context, the largest spender, which was the Blue Cross, Independence Blue Cross, an insurer out of Philadelphia, spent about $3 million, which is by far the largest. And it really goes back to API's history. This is the group that came up with the plan back, several decades ago to basically intentionally spread misinformation about climate change to the American people. They knew about climate change and had that data and information back all the way in 1958 and met and actually decided we're going to purposely hide this information that we have and lie to the American people because we think the idea of people, being affected by climate change is going to hurt our profits. And that's what they did.
Yeah. And we started getting some traction on these kind of tactics with the whole kind of Exxon New campaign, when kind of a whole bunch of documents that came out say Exxon knew this stuff, their own scientists knew out. We saw some reporting on that, and which is fantastic that we get to see this and we get to track it next to what happened with tobacco and seeing the same tactics, not only the same tactics, but the same people being employed to execute the same strategy of kind of disinformation and so on. What's API, I think, which is why I thought your article was so important, is because, like, as you've already said, is API, nobody knows what the hell API is. Right. And so it remains, even if Exxon gets flagged, right, or, you know, BP gets flagged, these groups continue on to doing their work. And, you know, these industries can say, well, look, that's API. That's our lobbying arm. That we're not doing that as Exxon, you know. And I think about this every single time I'll go to, you know, fill up gas in my car and I see like, hey, for every gallon you think we plant a tree and all of this. I'm like, this is so insidious. But it is, you know, it does allow for them to continue reaping in the profits while they're undermining that kind of, you know, the public sentiment that is needed to, you know, really dramatically shift our economies to save our freaking planet, it would seem.
Right. Yeah, it gives them cover. I mean, they can say, API can say, well, we represent 600 different companies with lots of different interests, but really it is these handful of giant oil companies driving their agenda on a federal level, and even probably more so in states. And I just want to give you a summary of the profits that some of these oil companies brought in just last year, so you can see how small of a drop in the bucket this 1.8 million is, even though it's a lot for Pennsylvania compared to other companies. So Exxon brought in nearly 56 billion in 1 year. Shell was 40 billion, Chevron 35.5 billion, and Marathon Oil 16.4 billion. So these are companies that make hundreds of millions of dollars a day.
This is like just like literally pocket change, right? For them dropping this kind of money. I mean, which again has a huge disproportionate impact in our politics. Right. But for them, it's nothing. They don't even miss it. It's like stuff, you know, change they found in the couch cushions after their big parties, it would seem. You know, it's like that level of stuff.
Right. And it allows them to continue their legacy of disinformation, really. In Pennsylvania, it's a little bit unique. It doesn't operate like typical trade associations or even other corporations in Pennsylvania in terms of lobbying or campaign donations. API doesn't give anything in campaign donations. Some of these big oil companies do, for sure, to state legislators, congresspeople, the governor. But API only focuses on lobbying, which includes their two primary lobbyists actually going and meeting with legislators, hosting events, things like that. But it also includes them being the go-to people to testify on behalf of the oil and gas industry whenever the state legislature holds a hearing about energy or new taxes or the environment. They write op-eds consistently in major papers all over the state and local papers. They buy TV ads and create TV ads, social media ads, and they also, you know, do their version of organizing, which is getting their members in the state to send letters or get their employees to mobilize in favor or against policies that they want. So it's not even just about their influence on state legislators. They're trying to create a culture of a state that is pro oil and gas, and they drive that narrative home every chance they get. And that's what I mean by they want to drown out the voices of everyday people that are saying, you know, we just want clean air and clean water, but they're being drowned out by this artificial voice just because it's backed by millions of dollars, saying, well, no, it's actually about jobs and it's about bringing, you know, money to your economy. And we know that that's a lot of false promises. I want to mention the Shell cracker plant in Beaver.
Yeah, this is a great example. I mean, this is one of the examples I wanted to give out, kind of the focus in on, is because this is astounding in terms of what we're talking about the impact of this kind of lobbying, as you said, to kind of create a culture around this, and never mind the amount of money that Shell itself is pumping into the system, literally. But yeah, go ahead. Let's talk about that. And I also then want to talk about some of the front groups and some of these histories of the lobbying efforts that they've done. What I also found fascinating, your piece about was what they did in terms of resisting the nuclear industry. Like that was just like that came out of here. But let's go back to the Shell. I mean, I'm just kind of like flying around. Yeah, bring us back to Shell in Beaver County.
Yeah, and that it was interesting, the nuclear energy conflict. But first, I mean, I just told you Shell brought in $40 billion last year. So in that context, it makes no sense policy-wise that the state of Pennsylvania gave them a $1.65 billion tax credit to create the Shell cracker plant in Beaver County and Potter Township. It was just recently opened. I remember I know people that work for the trade unions that went to work on it. It was one of the biggest infrastructure projects in the country. And it very quickly became one of the largest polluters in the state. So a cracker plant is basically, it's called the petrochemical industry. It produces these pellets that are then used to make plastic and other chemical products. And it
another wonderful thing for our environment, just putting it out there.
You can imagine it doesn't produce a lot of healthy things.
Yes.
So it, during that process, releases toxic chemicals into the air that cause things like cancer, asthma, other diseases that people in the area in Beaver County are breathing in whenever Shell goes above their, allowed amount of pollution, which is also, they shouldn't be allowed to pollute at all, but they even exceed the state regulations frequently. They were recently fined $10 million to make up for the fact that they exceeded their allowable limit several times. And $10 million is, again, a drop in the bucket compared to the amount that Shell makes. So they factor that into their cost. But the Breathe project had a really great stat that I loved. That was, we spent $2.7 million per job on that project. So if you're saying it was because it was for jobs, think about all the other projects that we could have invested in to bring jobs to the state. Pennsylvania ranks 45th in renewable energy production. We could be investing in solar, wind technology, but instead we gave, a company that makes hundreds of millions of dollars a day, we gave them $1.65 billion to bring this project here. And you can see why then these companies spend this little amount of money on lobbying, because they get such a massive return on investment.
Yeah, and then on top, to add insult to injury, they get a 15-year tax holiday afterwards where they don't even need to pay taxes. So, I mean, all the stuff, all the damage that they're causing, they're not even contributing to, like, the state government, which is ultimately is where things it's gonna fall, right? It's gonna fall on the state government in order to clean up what's happening there, to deal with the kind of the the impact on people's health. I mean, we had, I think I sent this to you an email too. We had Christina Marusik on the show kind of a couple of weeks back talking about her new book, A New War on Cancer. And she's done this reporting about how these chemicals from the kind of fossil fuel industry are showing up in people's bodies. And now you've got this, like you said, this massive kind of infrastructure investment by this company that's producing more of these like contaminants, that's able to pollute at will pretty much, because it can just kind of like, oh, let's go check the other couch cushion in the other room or in one of our other houses where we can kind of go pull that out in order to make this go away. We'll pay the fine and we'll go on there. And meanwhile, people are paying the price.
Right. And you're right. They have this tax-free 15 years where they're not even bringing money into the municipalities or counties that they're in. So the economic, benefit of a few jobs that mostly are gone now after the construction phase is over, pales in comparison to the detriment on people's public health in that area. It's really sad.
Yeah, I almost want that statistic that, so was $2.4 million per job? Is that what you said? It's like, that's like almost, I'm sorry, what?
2.7 million per job.
2.7 million per job. It's almost the kind of things you want people to have on placards, like for like public meetings when, their towns basically say, look, we have no money. It was like, this is how much we paid like Shell in order to produce one job, right? You're telling me that we can't get books in our schools. You're telling me that our roads have to keep all the potholes there, or we have to tear up the asphalt and throw down kind of like, oil and pebbles down. right? Because we can't afford that. But meanwhile, this company gets tax-free for 15 years while it wrecks our health. That's pretty amazing. And, you know, and like you said in here, this goes back, I mean, Pennsylvania has this long history with fossil fuels, and it seems like there's just a lesson that is not getting learned by state government. And that's just part of the kind of money that seems to be flooding our politics. And it's not just Republicans. And we see Democrats are also kind of shilling for the fossil fuel industry too as well. I remember, I forget the guy's name, but you know, the Democrats who are out there kind of in Southwest PA, they're, you know, and I can understand it to a certain degree. They're caught between what they perceive as a rock and a hard place, right? For me, you know, whatever. I mean, the hard place is our climate future, right? So, I mean, you have to make a hard choice to say no to fossil fuels. Okay, I get it for your thing. But anyways, I mean, it just does seem like that they're running away. And that, you know, you mentioned also in the article that, you know, we even saw, you know, Governor Shapiro, right, and even on his transition team had some of these key people that were on there. And you talk about this as part of this revolving door of the fossil fuel industry. Could you get into that just a little bit?
Yeah. So one thing that we always do when we find these trade associations that are spending this amount of money on lobbying, or front groups that are spending this amount of money on lobbying, is we want to know who those lobbyists actually are. And a lot of times you'll find that those are people that worked in government roles for sometimes decades in the past. So they are being paid just for their relationships in the state government. And the revolving door is called a revolving door for a reason, because those people go in and out of government and then get paid millions of dollars for their lobbying. So at the American Petroleum Institute and their Pennsylvania chapter, they have two lobbyists, Stephanie Wisman, who used to be with the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce, has been the executive director of API Pennsylvania for a while now, and was actually appointed to Governor Shapiro's transition team on the Energy Committee, along with coal lobbyists from CNX, a representative from the Commonwealth Energy Group, a representative from the American Gas Association, from Robindale Energy, which is another coal company, and a former director at Exxon, another giant electric utility. So Shapiro really wanted the voice of fossil fuels on his transition team, which just speaks volumes to his priorities. Of course, he had some environmental advocates, but I mean, this is the exact case where those voices of people with lots of money and lots of power from these corporations do drown out those other voices. And we saw the ramifications of that. Shapiro appointed a former Exxon executive, again, a giant, one of the largest utility companies in the country that relies on fossil fuels. He appointed one of their former executives to be secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection. And, you know, who knows if the American Petroleum Institute played a large role in that. But I think just the fact that all of these representatives from the fossil fuel industry were on that team, it does make you wonder how much of an influence they had over that pick.
Well, and like you said too, is like API's like primary role here too is to kind of create that culture, right? So you're flooding it in the background, so it makes sense to everybody. Like, oh, it doesn't seem unusual that you would appoint like a head of a fossil fuel company to, or an electricity company, to the Environmental Protection Agency, right? So it just seems like, oh, okay, this is just bull-siderism winning the day once again.
Right. And that doesn't even include the associate director, the other lobbyist in Pennsylvania for API, was the executive director of the Pennsylvania State House Energy Committee for over 10 years. So he knows exactly how the Energy Committee in the state legislature works, and probably still has, you know, relationships with the leaders of both parties. He served under the Wolf administration. And imagine how valuable he is to the big oil companies, who can use his relationships and his probably goodwill among the Energy Committee in both the House and the Senate. That's untold influence that, you know, environmental groups just don't have.
Yeah, it's also, you know, if anybody pays close attention to the way that kind of, you know, laws get made and so on, is that all the back and forth and kind of making the law, you know that there's little loopholes there, there's little gaps in the law, there's things that the legislators themselves know that, okay, this thing could be exploited or this thing could be, but they just don't talk about it because it's, you know, the nitty gritty of the legislation. You take a guy like that who was instrumental in writing some of these laws, going to work for those industries, he can just basically say, okay, you know what you need to do? There's this part of the law that most people don't know about, and here's what you do, blah, 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 blah. Right. And so it allows them to exploit these little loopholes that, you know, most of us never even know that are going on. And meanwhile, we're getting sicker, and that, you know, the climate emergency is approaching that much more quickly if it's not here already. I mean, we haven't seen this week, as we talked about.
Right. And they're in the same social circles. I mean, these are people getting invited to all the swanky political parties in Harrisburg. And, you know, they have these relationships that they don't want to cross someone who they used to work with for a decade. Or if someone from, you know, API who's worked there for 10 years calls a pivotal senator or House of Representatives member and says, you know, we need you to vote against this, it's going to be hard for people to ignore that whenever they have that close relationship, and that kind of money is being spent.
It's just so crazy. The other thing you also mentioned here is that, you know, what the API has also done in the past is has kind of funded front groups, right, that get out there. And so it's like, this is like two steps then removed from the industry itself. We get these, you know, innocuous sounding, or say pro-democracy or citizens, you know, pro-citizen kind of organizations, but they're out there just doing the dirty work of the fossil fuel industries. Can you talk a little bit about that too as well?
Yeah. Yeah, it is fascinating that they come up with these degrees of separation to get it off of their hands. So the American Petroleum Institute, and sometimes in partnership with other right-wing groups or the Chamber of Commerce, sets up and funds these front groups that, if you, like you said, go on their website, you might think, hey, this seems good. You know, they are talking about jobs. One of the groups that API funds is called Citizens to Protect Pennsylvania Jobs. Sounds great. You know,
yeah, who's against that, right? I
mean, the other one was Citizens Against Nuclear Bailouts. Again, good messaging. No one likes bailouts. That's a term that's very loaded in American politics. And then another one was Stop New Energy Taxes. So let's take Citizens Against Nuclear Bailouts first, because this was a couple years ago a vehicle that these companies put a lot of money into, both these big oil companies and natural gas companies, with interest in protecting fracking in Pennsylvania. So the nuclear industry was in trouble. The nuclear industry is, you know, not what I would call a renewable energy source. That's kind of debated in the environmental world, but a lot of utilities still rely on it. And there was talk of trying to provide them subsidies to help bail them out of this hard time. And the nuclear energy industry oftentimes is in competition with oil and gas, because it's different energy sources, different companies. So in lots of states, the oil and gas industry took advantage of the situation and started these front groups opposing any sort of bailout for the nuclear energy industry, even though these oil and gas companies themselves are getting lots and lots of subsidies, as we just talked about. They're against subsidies for any other industry that might be in competition with them. So they spend millions of dollars, not only through this front group, but through API and individually as, you know, separate companies. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on lobbying. And in Pennsylvania, they were successful in stopping any subsidies from going to the nuclear industry. That ended up not being the final nail in the coffin. They eventually recovered after years, but that's just an example of the kind of power that these front groups can have. And you did have to do some digging to find out who was behind that front group. There were only a handful of articles, and a lot of them were after the fact, after these campaigns were actually happening. So they do an effective job of kind of tricking the media and making it seem like this is some sort of grassroots movement, even though it's funded directly by these big oil and gas companies.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And as we see the kind of, like, you know, this continued downsizing of our media, this becomes even more difficult. I mean, we see right now, we have Gannett workers that have been on strike, are kind of threatening to have even larger strikes now. We see newsrooms getting smaller and smaller, and organizations like yours, organizations like LittleSis are kind of, say, filling these gaps. But meanwhile, the media becomes dominated by, those folks who have got a ton of money to get their messaging out there. And reporters, again, I don't want to always fault journalists for it, because I mean, you talk to any journalist who's out there who's actually a good journalist, you simply cannot pay attention to everything at once. And especially when you got new organizations and front groups seem to be emerging like every other year with great sounding names. Just doing that kind of work of digging into, like you said, digging in to find out who the hell is this now, right? Who is this organization? It's pretty remarkable.
Right. And sometimes they do a good job of not even having to report until a year or 2 years later, because these giant companies can get around being held accountable to report their donations to friend groups, for example. But another example I wanted to mention, and this is probably something people in Pennsylvania have seen in headlines every budget season, is like, when are we going to start taxing the natural gas industry? Pennsylvania is the only major oil and gas producing state to not have a severance tax on natural gas. And you hear, Governor Wolf proposed it a couple times. I think Shapiro has talked about it. I don't remember if it's in his budget currently. But it's just always this thing in the Pennsylvania politics that people propose, but it never actually happens. And that is partially because groups like this front group, Citizens to Protect Pennsylvania Jobs, and others like the Marcellus Shale Coalition vehemently oppose any new taxes on the natural gas industry. And it benefits the oil industry too, because they don't want taxes on their projects either. So they've done a very effective job at using these front groups to, again, make it seem like it's a grassroots effort, make it seem like it's a broad coalition, when really it's just a handful of companies spending millions of dollars on lobbying so they can save hundreds of millions or billions of dollars on taxes. And we keep seeing these politicians, give in to that culture of pretending like it's helping the state to not tax these companies. They can't go anywhere else. The natural gas is here. What they want is here. And they keep escaping these new taxes through these front groups and through these lobbying efforts.
That's remarkable. I can even remember back how effective the lobbying efforts have been in building that culture. I remember when the Marcellus Shale boom was just getting rolling. And there was some kind of reporting, again, as you said, reporting that comes up after the fact, right? I think with some folks from the Smog blog, I believe, were kind of digging some of this stuff up that I was talking to at the time, where like after the fact, there was people in the industry, even at that time, which they were ready to pay, right? They were ready to pay the severance tax at the beginning because they just factored it into there, but they realized that the lobbying efforts and the moves that they had made among politicians were so effective that they were surprised that they were going to get into Pennsylvania and exploit the natural gas here and put all these fracking chemicals in the ground and not have to pay a dime. It was remarkable.
It puts the state in a very defensive and vulnerable situation when we're saying that the state isn't powerful enough to take on these industries and actually make them pay their fair share. We just cower to whoever the highest bidder is. And I think that's why it's important to call out these front groups and, these trade associations, if you're an organizer, to say, this isn't some sort of grassroots movement. This is a handful of companies. The people of Pennsylvania do want this tax money to fund things like renewable energy projects, public schools, a fair system to protect people that are unemployed, affordable housing. We're trying to come up with money to fund whole home repair right now. Think of all the things that we could actually fund with that tax money. And yet we're listening to these front groups that, have a couple of corporate backers and well-paid lobbyists. It shouldn't be as easy for politicians to get away with this.
100%. I was just thinking about, I was so encouraged to see Elizabeth Fiedler and others had proposed this thing about solar in the schools. Basically what I've been saying for years, like, You've got all these schools with big flat roofs that are sun's beating down on them all day long. It would make sense to do this. But again, you could just imagine, oh, well, if we tax that industry, we're just going to take all that tax money, we're going to put it into this program so we can get rid of these people here. And it's always been remarkable to me too as well, because she's like, Pennsylvania, the politicians have been so cowed where they're, you're looking at this and you're like, wait, they want the gas that's here. So there's no place for them to go, right? It's not they could say, well, we're just not going to come. Well, okay, then you don't get the gas. And then it's like they don't even use their own power, but that's a whole other conversation. But like you said, about so important to talk about who these front groups are and so on. And this is why I love the work that LittleSis is doing. And I'm sorry, at the beginning of the show, I wanted people to talk a little bit about the work that LittleSis does. I want to make sure we plug it, that, do check out everything that's happening over there. You go to littlesis.org. You want to look at, there's a great kind of online, I don't know if you call it, it's like the news kind of version of that, where it says it's at news.littlesis.org. We can see all the reporting, the news and analysis there. Can you talk a little bit more about why this organization kind of needs to exist right now, and some of the kind of work that you're doing, and other things that you're paying attention to at the moment?
Definitely. Like you said at the beginning, LittleSis is the opposite of Big Brother. So we are a watchdog that looks up at corporations and monitors corporations and billionaires that have influence over our elected officials and government. We do three things. One, we do produce our own research, whether that's on the news portion. We have a blog called Eyes on the Ties. You can find it at the news.littlesis.org. We also produce our own independent research for campaigns that are taking on big oil and gas companies, natural gas companies, healthcare insurers, running active campaigns that need on-the-ground research to benefit their campaign. We also provide research training for activists and organizers that want to learn how they can do this for themselves, how they can research a corporation, research campaign finance, lobbying, things like that. If you subscribe to our newsletter, follow our website, you can look out for whenever our trainings are. We try to do them once a month. And we also provide an online tool that organizers and researchers can use to track, we call it the involuntary Facebook of the 1%. So billionaires, the wealthy, CEOs, we keep information about them and their connections, their board ties, political donations, family members, everything like that. It's open source, so anyone can add anything. You just need to create an account and fact check, provide sources, of course. But it's all really to benefit the movement and groups that are working for social, environmental, economic justice. Because research is important. You have to know what you're up against. You have to know what you're fighting for, and you have to know where your sources of leverage are. So if you know the front groups and the trade associations and the corporations behind them, you can start to actually go after the real bad actors in your state. And it only takes a little bit of research.
100%. And I think, and like you said, some of the tools that are on the website are just fantastic. I mean, you get dig in right away, access to tons of fantastic information. I can't say enough about, the research that has come out of LittleSis, the work that you're doing and others at LittleSis have been doing. I've been kind of slowly flagging some other folks, as part of it, are producing other things to try to put as much of a spotlight as we can in our little space here, this media space, on the work that you're doing for exactly those reasons. I mean, we're seeing this in Bucks County, to shift gears just a minute, but it's the same principle with everything that's been happening in the school board races here in Bucks County and across the Commonwealth, right? It's the same process, right? And this is when we had you on before talking about Jeffrey Yass. It's like these people work from the same playbook. Right? It's very similar dynamic, but getting to the point where you can see, understand how to track this and how to do the research, that's the tricky part. And organizations like LittleSis really are kind of the tools of the movement, if you will.
Exactly, yeah. And if I could give a shout out to some of the groups working on the Shell cracker plant.
Yes, please.
And air pollution there. I used a lot of information from Eyes on Shell, which is a coalition fighting the Shell cracker plant, and currently have a lawsuit against them. The Breathe Project is one organization within that coalition that also does great research and work on the Shell cracker plant. The Center for Coalfield Justice in Washington County does a lot of work to go after the coal and natural gas industry in Washington County and hold them accountable. The Clean Air Council has done a lot of work on air quality in Pennsylvania, and the Ohio Valley River Institute has been doing really great research, kind of breaking down the jobs figures and saying, no, actually, these industries have not been good economically for this region. So all these groups have been doing great work pushing back against this cultural narrative that the industry's been pushing. So if you have time, go check out their website, support them and the work they're currently doing to fight this industry.
100%. And I'll make sure that kind of after when we get the full show notes up, that I'll put links to all those organizations that you mentioned there, because there is fantastic work. Because it like brings us back to right where you started us tonight, is to say the reason why the API, and this is like, I guess, the flip side, and this is the positive side that we can glean from your reporting and what you found here, is that the only reason the API is dumping so much money into Pennsylvania is because the pushback is getting to the point where they realize they have to, because they're losing the battle.
Exactly. We need to keep up the fight, drown out their voices, make sure, that I don't mind them spending money, but we need to make sure we're louder than they are.
100%. Well, Aly, I appreciate you so much coming on coming onto the show tonight. Like as always, your reporting is fantastic. The work you're doing at LittleSis is great. Make sure in tonight's show notes you'll find links to Aly's article. The American Petroleum Institute loves Pennsylvania and its lobbying shows. Be a link there. Make sure you check out LittleSis at littlesis.org. The Eyes and the Ties News and Analysis, that blog at news.littlesis.org. And you can follow Aly on Twitter at Aly, ALYMS77, for all the kind of updates. I really appreciate you coming on the show, and thanks so much for your work.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for covering this.
All right, everybody. Thank you all for tuning out tonight. And just more, tools and food and fuel for the movement going on here. Thank you all for tuning in. This Friday, we're going to be doing a whole bunch of updates on the school boards, because it has been an absolute shit show happening here in Bucks County. So we'll make sure that we'll be talking a bunch of that on Friday. And next Monday, remember that we'll have Mark Engler here talking a little bit about some kind of inside-outside movement building strategies here. So this is Kevin Mahoney, creator and founder of Raging Chicken. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Don't tune out. Tuning in tonight. Spending a little time with us. Keep up the fight. Keep up the struggle. Have a great week, all. See ya!